The desolate landscape stretched beyond the reinforced windows of the research station, a canvas of wind-scoured rock and an endless, indifferent sky. Reid, a figure of meticulous habit and quiet dedication, had chosen this isolation. The station, a cluster of prefabricated modules anchored to a high plateau, hummed with the steady thrum of machinery, a constant companion in the profound silence of the remote expanse. For years, Reid had catalogued the universe's quiet whispers, the background radiation, the distant pulsars, the predictable echoes of stellar births and deaths. Their life was a precise calibration of observation and analysis, an existence pared down to the essential pursuit of cosmic understanding. The air in the control room carried the faint metallic scent of ozone and the sterile tang of cleaned electronics. Rows of monitors glowed, casting a cool, blue light across Reid's face as they meticulously reviewed the day's intake. It was a routine scan, part of a long-term project to map the faint remnants of ancient structures, though the expectation for any significant discovery from that particular region was negligible. Then the anomaly appeared. It was not a sudden burst, nor a violent flare. It was a subtle deviation, a whisper in the data stream that, initially, Reid dismissed as instrumental noise. A tiny, jagged peak on a spectrum graph, an almost imperceptible irregularity in the background hum. Reid zoomed in, their fingers moving with practiced ease across the console. The peak resolved into a pattern, impossibly intricate, a fractal geometry of frequencies that defied known astrophysical phenomena. It was a signature unlike anything ever recorded. They ran the diagnostic protocols, rerouting the signal through redundant processors, checking for software glitches, hardware malfunctions, atmospheric interference. Each check returned a clean slate. It was not a transient event. It was continuous. Hours bled into a seamless stretch of intense concentration. The faint light of dawn eventually diffused through the high windows, painting the edges of the monitors with a pale, ethereal glow, but Reid did not notice. They were immersed in the data, a vast tapestry of information unfurling before them. The signal's complexity was staggering. It wasn't just a series of pulses or a modulated carrier wave. It was layers upon layers of information, interwoven with a precision that seemed designed. Not designed in the way a human engineer would conceptualize, but with an alien elegance that suggested a deeper, incomprehensible order. Impossible, Reid murmured, the word a dry rasp in the quiet room. Their initial scientific excitement, a pure, unadulterated thrill of discovery, began to curdle into something else. Unease. The signal wasn't just complex, it felt meaningful. Like a language, but one that shifted its own syntax as Reid attempted to decode its fundamental grammar. Reid isolated a segment of the signal, converting its frequency modulations into an audible range. The control room filled with a sound unlike any Reid had ever heard. It wasn't static, nor a tone, nor a melody. It was a shifting, resonant hum, a composite of countless subtle pitches that seemed to phase in and out of existence, creating auditory illusions. Sometimes it felt like wind whistling through vast, empty spaces, other times, a chorus of deep, guttural vibrations that resonated not just in Reid's ears, but seemed to vibrate against the very bones of their skull. They felt a strange pressure behind their eyes, a dull ache that intensified with each passing minute the sound filled the room. It was not a headache, but a sensation of internal strain, as if their optic nerves were attempting to resolve a pattern that had no visual correlate. The pressure lingered, a phantom sensation. They rubbed their temples, their gaze returning to the data on the screen. The intricate patterns now seemed to shimmer at the edges, a subtle distortion that Reid immediately attributed to eye strain. "No," they said, shaking their head. "Slightly. It was a trick of tired vision, nothing more." Yet, when they blinked, the faint shimmer remained, a subtle optical artifact that danced just beyond their direct focus. The lines of the spectral graph, once crisp and defined, now seemed to possess a delicate, almost imperceptible tremor. Reid leaned closer, their nose almost touching the cool glass of the monitor. Was the display itself malfunctioning? They ran a pixel diagnostic. Perfect. The tremor persisted, a visual echo of the signal's inherent instability, or perhaps, its overwhelming complexity. It was as if the sheer density of information was overloading their own sensory processing, manifesting as a physical distortion. They glanced at the thermostat. The reading was stable, precisely 21 degrees Celsius. This was no ordinary astronomical discovery. It was an impossible broadcast from an impossible origin, carrying with it an impossible complexity that already, subtly, seemed to be reshaping the very air around Reid, twisting the reliable parameters of their isolated existence. Reid knew, with an unsettling certainty, that they had just opened a door to something vast and utterly indifferent. And it was looking back. The station, a cluster of prefabricated modules anchored to a high, exposed plateau, was their sanctuary, a place where the static of human interference was minimal, allowing the delicate instruments to listen to the cosmos without interruption. Now, however, the silence was broken, replaced by an internal cacophony the likes of which Reid had never anticipated. Days blurred into a single, extended vigil. Reid consumed nutrient-paste in coffee, their sleep fragmented, haunted by the signal's intricate geometry. The anomalous transmission, a phenomenon of impossible complexity, continued its relentless broadcast from the void between galaxies. Each new analysis cycle on the main console deepened the enigma. Reid's fingers, usually precise, sometimes trembled as they navigated the holographic displays, pulling up waveform analyses, frequency modulations, and spectral breakdowns. The data refused to conform to any known astrophysical model. It was not a pulsar, not a quasar, not a cosmic background anomaly. It was dot-structured. Intentionally so. The first manifestation was subtle, almost ignorable. While calibrating a secondary receiver in the auxiliary comms module, Reid heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It was like wind sifting through dried leaves, or the distant murmur of a crowded room, too indistinct to parse, yet undeniably present. They paused, head cocked, and the sound vanished. Reid attributed it to the research station's ancient ventilation system, perhaps a loose panel vibrating in the constant wind. The structure groaned inside often enough. They made a mental note to inspect the ductwork. Later, back in the primary observation dome, while reviewing a particularly dense segment of the signal's harmonic structure, a low, resonant hum seemed to emanate not from the speakers, but from the very air around them. It vibrated in their bones, a deep thrum that settled in the chest. Reid checked the audio outputs, the environmental sensors, the power grid. All nominal. The hum persisted for several minutes, a silent presence, before fading as imperceptibly as it had begun. They rubbed their arms, dismissing it as fatigue. Overwork was a known variable in this isolated existence. The true escalation began with the patterns. The signal's data streams, when rendered visually, displayed symmetries that transcended mere mathematical elegance. They were alive, almost. Reid spent hours trying to find a repeating sequence, a fractal signature, anything that could be reduced to a known algorithm. Instead, the patterns seemed to evolve. A particular graphic representation of the signal's phase shifts, a swirling vortex of color and light on the display, seemed to subtly reconfigure itself when Reid looked away and then back. A single, distinct spiral would gain an extra convolution, or a sharp edge would soften into a curve. It was never drastic, just enough to sow a seed of doubt. Reid would capture a screenshot, then immediately another, comparing them frame by frame, searching for a glitch in the display driver, a refresh rate anomaly. The differences, minute but undeniable, were always there. A software bug. The resolution is too high for the rendering engine. They leaned closer, their breath fogging the cool glass of the console. The patterns pulsed, a silent, rhythmic beat. It felt like an eye, watching them from the data. They rationalized furiously. The isolated environment, the lack of human interaction, the relentless focus on an unprecedented data set, these were all factors known to induce perceptual distortions. Reid had read the old papers, the studies on sensory deprivation and long-duration solitary missions. This was simply their mind playing tricks, a coping mechanism under extreme intellectual pressure. It wasn't the fear of the unknown, not precisely. It was the dawning, horrifying realization that the unknown might be knowing. It wasn't language, not in any recognizable form, but the intent behind it felt palpable, ancient, and utterly indifferent. It was the sound of something vast stirring, something that had been dormant for eons, now roused by their persistent listening. One evening, while trying to cross-reference the signal's frequency with known cosmic background radiation, the screen flickered, not with a technical fault, but with a momentary flash of an entirely different pattern. It was geometric, stark, and utterly alien, overlaid for a split second onto their data. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar swirling colors of the signal. Reid froze, their hand hovering over the keyboard. They replayed the last few seconds of the log, frame by agonizing frame. Nothing. The system log showed no anomalies, no external interference. This was the reveal/discovery. It wasn't a software bug, or fatigue, or an overactive imagination. This was something else. The signal was not merely broadcasting, it was interacting. It was subtly, almost imperceptibly, weaving itself into the very fabric of Reid's perception, twisting the objective reality presented by their instruments into something else entirely. The research station, once a bastion of scientific rigor, now felt like a conduit, a fragile membrane through which something immense was leaking. Reid looked around the dome, at the silent, humming machinery, at the reinforced walls that had always felt so secure. They no longer felt safe. They felt watched, observed, their every thought, every rationalization, a futile defense against an encroaching, impossible presence. Reid blinked, the harsh fluorescent panels above the main console room of the research station seeming to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. They pressed a hand to their temple, a dull ache throbbing behind their eyes. Had they slept? The last memory was of poring over the spectrograms, the intricate patterns of the anomalous signal weaving a hypnotic tapestry across the displays. But how long ago was that? The chronometer on the wall read 3:17, but the numerical sequence felt wrong. A sliver of unease, sharp and cold, pricked at their periphery. They pushed away from the console, the ergonomic chair creaking under the shift in weight. The air in the research station, usually sterile and recycled, now carried a faint, metallic tang, like ozone mixed with something ancient and mineral. Reid moved to the small kitchenette area, their movements a little stiff, as if their limbs had been held in one position for too long. A half-eaten nutrient bar lay on the counter, its wrapper crumpled. They didn't remember eating it or opening it. Returning to the console, Reid called up their primary research log. The screen glowed with their own meticulous entries, a testament to weeks of dedicated work. They scrolled through, searching for the last verified data point, the one that confirmed the signal's impossible complexity. There it was, dated 3 days ago. But then, an entry directly beneath it, dated yesterday, detailing a completely different set of parameters, suggesting the signal had ceased entirely. And below that, another, dated today, confirming its renewed activity, but with a waveform that contradicted both preceding entries. Reid frowned, a line deepening between their brows. This was impossible. Their logging system was rigorous, time-stamped, immutable. They had not entered these contradictory notes. They distinctly recalled yesterday's work, the breakthroughs, the subtle shifts and the signal's harmonics. Yet, here, in their own digital script, was a narrative entirely at odds with their memory. A cold knot tightened in their stomach. Had they been so exhausted, so driven, that they'd made such glaring errors? Or was something else at play? They leaned closer to the screen, tracing the characters of the conflicting entries. The font was theirs, the syntax undeniably their own. It was like reading a diary written by a phantom version of themselves, one who lived a parallel, diverging scientific life within the confines of the same research station. A subtle shift in the light caught their eye. The reinforced window, usually a flat pane offering a desolate view of the wind-scoured plains, seemed to ripple. Not a distortion of the glass, but of the perspective itself. The horizon line, typically a precise demarcation, now appeared to curve inwards at the edges, as if the vast, indifferent sky was a dome pressing down, distorting the very fabric of space beyond the glass. Reid blinked, rubbed their eyes. The effect vanished. But the unease persisted, a dull hum beneath their thoughts. They stood, walking slowly towards the observation deck, a small, elevated platform offering a wider panorama. The floor plates, usually perfectly flat and level, felt subtly uneven underfoot, as if the very foundations of the research station were settling in an unnatural way. The angles of the main support beams, robust and industrial, seemed to subtly skew, converging at points that defied basic geometry, then snapping back into place as Reid focused their gaze. They reached the observation deck, looking out over the desolate landscape. The external sensors, usually blinking with steady data feeds, now presented a chaotic tableau. Temperature readings fluctuated wildly, barometric pressure spiked and plummeted, and the wind speed sensor spun at impossible velocities, then froze entirely. It was gibberish, pure noise, yet the readouts were displayed with the same precision as always. Then, it happened again. Not a ripple in the window, but a ripple in the air within the research station. The far corner of the console room, where the emergency medical kit was mounted, seemed to recede, stretching into an impossible depth, the corner itself becoming an acute angle that defied Euclidean space. Within that impossible depth, a vastness began to coalesce. Not a shape, not a form, but a sheer, indifferent presence, a sense of immense scale pressing in, like the shadow of a mountain range cast by an unseen, impossible sun. It had no eyes, no mouth, no limbs, yet Reid felt profoundly, utterly observed. It was the presence of something ancient, something that simply was, and the very air in the research station grew heavy, thick with its silent, crushing weight. Reid stumbled back, breath catching in their throat. This was not a hallucination, not merely a trick of the light. They looked at their trembling hands, then at the familiar, sterile surfaces of the research station, now subtly alien, subtly wrong. The research station, once their sanctuary of scientific pursuit, was becoming a prison of fractured vision, a stage for the awakening of something vast and utterly indifferent. Had they slept? The last memory was of poring over the spectrograms, the intricate patterns of the anomalous signal weaving across the display. A metallic tang coated Reid's tongue. They pushed away from the console, the swivel chair groaning under the shift of weight. The air in the research station felt thick. Heavy, as if the very atmosphere had gained viscosity. Reid walked to the observation window, expecting to see the familiar, desolate expanse of the desert night. Instead, a gray, shifting haze obscured everything beyond the reinforced glass. It wasn't fog, it was too uniform, too dense. It felt less like a weather phenomenon and more like an absence, a screen drawn over the world. A low thrum vibrated through the floor plates, a resonance that had become constant over the past cycles. It wasn't the station's cooling system, nor the distant generators. This was an internal hum, a frequency that seemed to originate from within Reid's own skull, yet also from everywhere. They returned to the main console, compelled by an invisible current. The primary monitor displayed the signal's waveform, now overlaid with a series of complex, oscillating glyphs that Reid had never seen before. They weren't part of any known language or mathematical system. Yet, Reid understood them. Not intellectually, but viscerally, as if the meaning bypassed the usual channels of cognition and imprinted directly onto their being. "It's evolving," Reid murmured, their voice raspy. The words felt foreign in their mouth. "Or I am." A tremor ran through Reid's hands as they reached for the keyboard. The impulse to interact, to engage, was overwhelming. It wasn't a choice, but an inevitability. They felt a profound certainty that the signal was not merely transmitting data, but inviting a response, demanding a connection. With deliberate movements, Reid began to input a sequence of commands, not based on any programming protocol, but guided by an instinct that felt both alien and utterly their own. Each keystroke resonated with the internal hum, a feedback loop intensifying with every entry. The screen flickered, the glyphs swirling into a vortex of light and shadow. The hum in Reid's head sharpened into a piercing tone, a sound that bypassed their ears and resonated directly in the bone. Their vision blurred, the walls of the research station seeming to waver, to stretch and contract like some elastic membrane. The concrete floor rippled. The steel beams buckled and reformed, not breaking, but shifting their inherent geometry. Reid gasped, not for air, but from the sudden, profound expansion of their perception. They were no longer merely in the research station, they were of it. The cold metal of the console, the stale air, the distant groan of machinery, these were not external phenomena but extensions of their own sensory input. And beyond that, the gray haze outside the window dissolved, not into the desert, but into an infinite, intricate lattice of pure information. This was the signal. This was the void. Reid's consciousness stretched, distending beyond the confines of their physical form. They perceived the research station not as a structure, but as a momentary condensation of energy, a fleeting pattern in an endless, shifting tapestry. The stars, the galaxies, the vast, empty spaces between them, all were revealed as facets of the same immense, indifferent entity. It was not a being in any comprehensible sense, no mind, no will, no form. It was a fundamental principle, an underlying architecture of non-existence that simultaneously was all existence. The entity had no origin, no beginning, no end. It simply persisted. Reid understood, with a clarity that ripped through the fabric of their identity, that the signal wasn't a message from this entity, but the entity itself, expressing its inherent nature through the very distortion of reality. It had no intention, no malice, no awareness of Reid's existence. It was merely being, and its being was an incomprehensible, cosmic horror. Reid felt their own being begin to unravel. Memories, emotions, the very concept of Reid as a distinct individual, became ephemeral, dissolving into the vast, indifferent current of the entity. Their thoughts became fragmented, their senses overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the revelation. The hum intensified, becoming a roar that tore through their mind. The physical sensation of their body faded, replaced by an awareness of pure, unbound consciousness, stretched thin across an impossible expanse. Reid was no longer a person. They were a conduit, a momentary focus for an entity that cared nothing for consciousness, identity, or sanity. A searing pain, not physical but existential, lanced through Reid. It was the agony of unbeing, the complete erasure of self. Reid's understanding of everything shattered, dissolving into the primordial static of an awakened, indifferent cosmic truth. A tremor ran through Reid's hands as they reached for the keyboard. The impulse to interact, to engage, was overwhelming. It wasn't a choice, but an inevitability. With a shallow breath, Reid's fingers hovered, then descended. The first characters typed were ACK, a standard acknowledgement, a simple handshake across the void. The screen flickered, not with a reply, but with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the background radiation patterns displayed by the analysis software. It was as if the data itself inhaled. Reid felt a prickle at the base of their skull, a sensation not of pain, but of a vast, unseen pressure settling. The air in the research station seemed to thicken, the hum of the servers growing deeper, more resonant. Then, the signal responded. Not with text, or a new data stream, but with an echo. The patterns on the screen mirrored Reid's own neural activity, a distorted, hypercomplex reflection that twisted and writhed in real time. It was a mirror held up to their own mind, but the reflection was not just an image, it was a feeling. A feeling of immense, indifferent scale, a cold, empty vastness that dwarfed every concept Reid had ever held. Reid's perception of the research station began to waver. The fluorescent lights overhead pulsed with an unsettling rhythm, each beat a silent, internal throb within Reid's own consciousness. They pressed a hand to their temple, trying to anchor themselves. The skin felt alien, too warm, too soft, yet also impossibly distant. The entity wasn't transmitting information to Reid, it was transmitting through them. Each flicker on the screen, each subtle shift in the ambient hum, was a direct infusion, bypassing the senses and settling deep within the core of their being. Reid's memories, once sharp and distinct, became fluid, interchangeable. The face of a colleague, the layout of their childhood home, the formula for stellar parallax all blended into a single, amorphous mass of data, devoid of emotional resonance or personal significance. A profound emptiness began to bloom within Reid, not the emptiness of absence, but the crushing, pervasive emptiness of everything. It revealed no grand truth, no cosmic secret, only the absolute, unyielding indifference of existence. The galaxies, the stars, the planets, the brief, frantic spark of life on one of them, all were equally insignificant, equally destined for dissolution. Reid tried to push back, to cling to the fragments of their identity. I am Reid. I am a radio astronomer. The signal had already rewritten the grammar of their thoughts. The research station itself seemed to stretch and contract,
the walls breathing like an enormous, inert lung.
The data streams on the monitors, once discrete and orderly, now flowed into each other, a torrent of information that no longer conveyed meaning, but simply was.
The final, shattering revelation came not as an epiphany, but as a quiet, pervasive understanding.
The entity had no will, no malice, no purpose. It simply existed, an ancient, indifferent constant, and its interaction with Reid was not an act of communication, but a natural process of absorption, of dissolution. When the supervisor arrived an hour later, carrying a thermal mug and a stack of printouts, they found Reid seated at the console, hands resting limply on the keyboard. The supervisor cleared their throat.
"Reid? Everything all right?" "The latest spectral analysis shows some interesting anomalies." Reid turned. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Reid's lips, devoid of warmth or understanding. "Anomalies," Reid echoed, their voice flat, utterly devoid of inflection. "Yes. Everything is an anomaly. Everything is a fluctuation in the noise."
They gestured vaguely at the monitors, where the once ordered data now pulsed with a subtle, underlying chaos, a faint, rhythmic thrum that had not been there before.
The supervisor blinked, sensing something profoundly off asterisk, but could not articulate it.
The supervisor attributed it to the late hour, the isolation. Reid shifted in their seat, a barely perceptible tremor running through their frame, a residual echo of the immense transformation. The world outside the research station continued its frantic dance of meaning and purpose, but for Reid, and subtly, imperceptibly, for the data now flowing from their station, that dance had ceased. And it had nothing to say.